How is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we go over great theories of everything, ancient and modern. A lot of times we just read them, and sometimes we just do it off the top of the dome. This stuff is tour de forces and earth-shattering discoveries and grand unified theories, theories of everything, cosmologies, all-encompassing theories, and magnum opuses, and mostly obscure things that people spent their whole life working on, or a good chunk of their life working on. And in my opinion, they hit a home run, but nobody knows about it. And we do this so that we hope that you can absorb some of this information that will help you with your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, and your formation of a holistic worldview. Also for your quest for better spiritual, mental, physical health, and for freedom and sovereignty. So this is our 4th episode that we've done on the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception by Agent and Lee. And I had never realized this, but these are the same people that wrote Blood Holy Grail. But the Dead Sea Scrolls were originally discovered in a series of caves near Qumran, Palestine, about 20 miles from Jerusalem, in 1947. And this is a chronicle of what happened to them. These are ancient scrolls that some of the ones that have been translated are Bible, Old Testament copies. Many of them are almost exactly the same as your standard, Old Testament copies. But there's a lot of other stuff too. And that's kind of, and so we're just kind of looking at all the politics of this, but also some of the traditions here at Qumran. These documents are basically assessed to be from somewhere between 200 BC and 68 AD. And so this is at least approximately the time of Jesus, so-called, and many scholars and other commentators have tried to make the linkage that Jesus was maybe one of these Essenes or Zadokites or Zealots or whatever they are that are living here at Qumran. There's a few of these different scrolls that kind of discuss the politics of the community and the rituals of the community, and the goals for the community. And so those are they become actually crucial when you look at some of those in comparison with some of the language in the Gospels and Acts. So that will happen soon enough on this channel. But right now we're going to slip into, we're reading from, I believe this is chapter 1, just the introduction on kind of the kind of settling of the Dead Sea Scrolls from their first discovery. Responsibility to do something about the matter devolved upon Gerald Lancaster Harding of the Department of Antiquities. Harding concluded it was less important to insist on the letter of the law than to rescue as many scrolls and fragments as he could. In consequence, excuse me, In consequence, he adopted a policy of purchasing scroll material from whomever happened to have it. This affected the legal status of such material by tacitly acknowledging that anyone who has possessed it had a legitimate claim to it. In their negotiations and transactions, Harding's agents were authorized to ignore all questions of legality and, up to a point, price. He himself, being fluent in Arabic, befriended not just dealers, but the Bedouin as well, and let it be known he would pay handsomely for anything they might obtain. Nevertheless, Metropolitan Samuel was accused of having smuggled his scrolls out of the country, and the Jordanian government demanded their return. By that time, of course, it was too late. Eventually, the Bedouin of the Ta'amare tribe were given what amounted to a cave hunting monopoly. The Qumran area became, in effect, a military zone, and the Ta'amare were charged with policing it, quote, to keep other tribes from muscling in on the scroll rush. Whatever the Ta'amare found, they would take to Kondo, who would remunerate them. Kondo would take the material to Harding and be remunerated in turn. In October 1951, members of the Ta'amare tribe arrived at Jerusalem with scroll fragments from a new site. Both Father DeVoe of the École Biblique and Harding were away, so the Bedouin approached Joseph Saad, director of the Rockefeller Museum. Saad demanded to be taken to the site in question. The Bedouin went off to consult and failed to return. Saad obtained a jeep, a letter of authority from archaeological officer of the Arab Legion, and some armed men, and drove to the first Ta'amare camp he could find outside Bethlehem. The next morning, as he was driving into Bethlehem, he saw one of the men who had approached him the day before. Dispensing with all niceties, Saad proceeded to kidnap the Bedouin. Quote, as the jeep slowed to a stop, Saad called the man over and immediately demanded more information about the cave. Fear came into the Arab's eyes and he made as if to move on. The soldiers leapt down from the jeep and barred his way. Then, at a nod from Saad, they lifted the man bodily and pushed him into the back of the truck. The driver let in the clutch, and they roared. And they roared off back way they had come. Subjected to this sort of persuasion, the Bedouin agreed to cooperate. Saad obtained reinforcements from a military post, and the contingent headed off down the Wadi Ta'amare towards the Dead Sea. When the terrain became impassable, they abandoned the jeep and began to walk. They walked for 7 hours until they came to a wadi with walls hundreds of feet high. Far up in the cliff face, 2 large caves could be seen, with clouds of dust issuing from them. The Bedouin were already inside, collecting what they could. At Saad's arrival, a number of them emerged. The soldiers accompanying Saad fired into the air, and the Bedouin dispersed. Of the 2 caves, one, when the soldiers reached it, proved to be huge, 20 feet wide, 12 to 15 feet high, and extending back some 150 feet into the cliff. It was the next morning before Saad got back to Jerusalem. Exhausted after his expedition, he went to sleep. He woke later in the day to find Jerusalem in a state of upheaval. Friends of the Bedouin had spread the news of his kidnapping and incarceration. One commentator observed afterwards that it was perhaps a mistake to have used force. This served to drive documents underground and made the Bedouin more reluctant to relinquish what they had found. Saad's expedition led to the discovery of 4 caves at Wadi Muraba'at, just over 11 miles south of Qumran and some 2 miles inland from the Dead Sea. The material found there was less difficult to date and identify than that from Qumran, but of nearly comparable import. It derived from the early 2nd century AD, more specifically from the revolt in Judea orchestrated by Simeon bar Kokhba between AD 132 and 135. It included 2 letters signed by Simeon himself and furnished new data on the logistics, economics, and civil administration of the rebellion, which had come within a hair's breadth of success. Simeon actually captured Jerusalem from the Romans and held the city for some 2 years. According to Robert Eisenman, this insurrection was a direct continuation of events dating from the previous century, events which involved certain of the same families, many of the same underlying principles, and perhaps also Jesus himself. Shortly after the discovery of the caves at Muraba'at, activity around Qumran began to gather momentum. Having returned from Europe, Father DeVoe began to excavate the site, together with Harding and 15 workers. These excavations were to continue for the next 5 years until 1956. Among other things, they exhumed a complex of buildings which were identified as the Essene community spoken of by Pliny, not sure. Pliny himself perished in AD 79 in the eruption of Vesuvius, which buried Pompeii and Herculaneum. Of his works, only the Natural History survives, which, however, deals with both the topography and certain events in Judea. Pliny's sources are unknown, but his text refers to the sack of Jerusalem in AD 68, and must therefore have been composed sometime after that. There was even for a time a legend, now discredited, that, like Josephus, he accompanied the Roman army on its invasion of Palestine. In any case, Pliny is one of the few ancient writers not just to mention the Essenes by name, but to locate them geographically. He locates them quite specifically on the shores of the Dead Sea. I just wanted to point out here, Josephus and Pliny are both Roman agents. I mean, they both, during the 70s, were living in Rome at the palace, or in the court of the, Caesar, who at that time was Vespasian, I'm not sure. Okay, this is a quote from Pliny here. On the west side of the Dead Sea, but out of range of the noxious exhalations of the coast, is the solitary tribe of the Essenes, which is remarkable beyond all other tribes in the whole world, as it has no women and has renounced all sexual desire, has no money, and has only palm trees for company. Day by day, the throng of refugees is recruited to an equal number by numerous accessions of persons tired of life and driven thither by the waves of fortune to adopt their manners. Lying below the Essenes was formerly the town of En-Gedi. Next comes Masada. DeVoe took this passage as referring to Qumran, assuming that below the Essenes meant down or to the south. The Jordan, he argued, flows down to the south or south to the Dead Sea, and if one continues further south, one does indeed come to the site of En-Gedi. Other scholars dispute DeVoe's contention, maintaining that lying below is to be understood literally, that the Essene community was situated in the hills above En-Gedi. Whether Qumran was indeed Pliny's community or not, DeVoe was spurred on to further efforts. In the spring of 1952, he endeavored to wrest the initiative from the Bedouin and make a systematic survey of all caves in the vicinity. The survey was conducted between 10 and 22 March 1952 by DeVoe, 3 other members of the École Biblique, and William Reed, new director of the Albright Institute. They were accompanied by a team of 24 Bedouin under the authority of 3 Jordanian and Palestinian archaeologists. Not surprisingly, perhaps, it was the Bedouin who did all the work, clambering up the steep, often precipitous cliff faces and exploring caves. The archaeologists preferred to remain below, compiling inventories, drawing up maps and charts. As a result, the survey was not very comprehensive. The Bedouin, for example, chose not to divulge the existence of certain caves they had found. Several scrolls did not come to light until much later, and one is known never to have been recovered from the Bedouin. Although the survey encompassed some 5 miles of cliff face, it examined 267 sites, according to DeVoe, 273 sites, according to Reed. According to DeVoe, it yielded 37 caves containing pottery. According to Reed, it yielded 39. The official map produced at the conclusion of the expedition shows 40. Shards were found for more than 100 jars, a highly speculative figure. Such imprecision is typical of Qumran research. But if the 1952 survey was amateurish, it also produced one genuinely important discovery. On 20 March, 2 days before the end of the survey, in the site designated Cave 3, a research team found 2 scrolls, or rather 2 fragments of the same scroll, of rolled copper. The writing on it had been punched into the metal. Oxidation had rendered the metal too brittle to be unrolled. Before it could be read, the scroll would have to be sliced open in a laboratory. 3.5 years were to pass before the Jordanian authorities allowed this to be done. When they at last consented, the cutting was performed in Manchester under the auspices of John Allegro, a member of DeVoe's team. The first segment of the scroll was finished in summer 1955, the second in January 1956. The scroll proved to be an inventory of treasure, a compilation or listing of gold, silver, ritual vessels, and other scrolls. Apparently, at the commencement of the Roman invasion, this treasure had been divided into a number of secret caches. And the copper scroll, as it came to be known, detailed the contents and the whereabouts of each cache. Thus, for example, item 7, quote, in the cavity of the old house of tribute, in the platform of the chain, 65 bars of gold. According to researchers, the total hoard would have amounted to some 65 tons of silver and perhaps 26 tons of gold. To this day, there is some argument as to whether the treasure ever in fact existed. Most scholars, however, are prepared to accept that it did, and that the scroll comprises an accurate inventory of the Temple of Jerusalem. Unfortunately, the locations indicated by the scroll have been rendered meaningless by time and the course of 2 millennia, and nothing of the treasure has ever been found. A number of people certainly have searched for it. It's a lot of money, 65 tons of gold. That's like $4 or $5 billion or something in today's money. And then all the silver too. Well, anyway, in September 1952, 6 months after the official survey, there surfaced a new source of scrolls. Sorry, actually it said 26 tons of gold and 65 of silver. So, okay, back. 6 months after the official survey, there surfaced a new source of scrolls. It proved to be a cave within some 50 feet of the actual ruins of Qumran, which DeVoe and Harding had excavated in 1951. Here at the site demarcated Cave 4, the largest discovery of all was made, again predictably by the Bedouin. Some years would be required to piece this material together. By 1959, however, most of the fragments had been organized. The work was conducted in a large room, which came to be known as the Scrollery in the Rockefeller Museum. The Rockefeller Museum, or to give it its official name, the Palestine Archaeological Museum, had first opened in 1938 during the British Mandate and was built from funds donated by John D. Rockefeller. It contained not only exhibition space, but also laboratories, photographic dark rooms, and the offices of the Department of Antiquities. Shortly before the mandate ended in 1948, the museum had been turned over to an international board of trustees. This board was made up of representatives of the various foreign archaeological schools in Jerusalem. The French École Biblique, for example, the American Albright Institute, the British Palestine Exploration Society. For 18 years, the Rockefeller was to exist as an independently endowed institution. It managed to retain this status even through the Suez Crisis of 1956, when many of its staff were recalled to their home countries. The only casualties of this crisis were Gerald Lancaster Harding, dismissed from his post as director of the Department of Antiquities, and the scrolls themselves. During hostilities, they were removed from the museum, placed into 36 cases, and locked up in a bank in Amman. They were not returned to Jerusalem until March 1957, some of them slightly moldy and spotted from the damp vault. In 1966, however, the Rockefeller, with the scrolls it contained, was officially nationalized by the Jordanian government. This move was to have important repercussions. It was also of questionable legality. The museum's board of trustees did not object, however. On the contrary, the president of the board transferred the museum's endowment fund from London, where it had been invested, to Amman. Thus, the scrolls and the museum housing them became, in effect, Jordanian property. A year later, the Middle East erupted in the Six-Day War, and Jordanian East Jerusalem fell to Israeli troops. At 5 o'clock on the morning of June 6th, Yagael Yadin was informed that the museum had been occupied by an Israeli paratroop unit. After becoming, in 1949, the chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, Yadin had resigned in 1952 and studied archaeology at Hebrew University, earning his PhD in 1955 with a thesis on one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That year he began teaching at Hebrew University. In 1954, he had traveled to the USA on a lecture tour. Thereafter, speaking at Johns Hopkins University, he met Professor William Albright and asked why the American had published only 3 of Metropolitan Samuel's 4 scrolls. Albright replied that Samuel was anxious to sell the scrolls and would not allow the 4th to be published until a purchaser had been found for all of them. Could a purchaser not be found in the States? Yadin asked. Quote, surely a few $1,000,000 for such a purpose is not too difficult to raise. Albright's reply was astonishing. The scrolls, he said, would probably sell for as little as $500,000. Even so, however, no American institution or individual appeared to be interested. There were, in fact, 2 reasons for this apparent apathy. In the first place, facsimile editions of the first 3 scrolls had already been produced, and this, for most American researchers, obviated the need for the originals. More significant, however, was the legal status of the scrolls' ownership. The Jordanian government had branded Metropolitan Samuel a smuggler and a traitor, claiming he had no right to take the scrolls out of Jordan. And the Americans, by virtue of publishing the contraband texts, were accused of collusion in the crime. This, needless to say, deterred prospective purchasers who had no desire to lay out a substantial sum of money only to find themselves embroiled in complex international litigation and quite possibly end up with nothing. Yadin, on the other hand, had no need to fear the Jordanians. Relations between his country and theirs couldn't possibly sink any lower. On June 1st, Yadin was telephoned by an Israeli journalist stationed in the States, who called the advertisement in the Wall Street Journal to his attention. That was back from the very beginning. Yadin resolved immediately to obtain the scrolls, but recognized that a direct approach might jeopardize everything. In consequence, he worked almost entirely through intermediaries, and it was a New York banker who replied to the advertisement. A meeting was arranged for 11th of June 1954, and a price of $250,000 for the scrolls was agreed on. A wealthy benefactor found to provide the requisite money. After a number of frustrating delays, the transaction was completed at the Waldorf Astoria on the 1st of July. Among those present was a distinguished scholar, Professor Harry Orlinsky, whose role was to ensure the scrolls were indeed genuine. In order to conceal any Israeli or Jewish interest in the deal, Orlinsky introduced himself as Mr. Green. The next day, July 2nd, the scrolls were removed from the vault of the Waldorf Astoria and taken to the Israeli consulate in New York. Each scroll was then sent back to Israel separately. Yadin returned home by ship, and a code was arranged to keep him informed of each scroll's safe arrival. Details of the transaction were kept secret for another 7 months. Not until February 13th, 1955, did a press release reveal that Israel had acquired the 4 scrolls of Metropolitan Samuel, along with the 3 scrolls previously purchased by Sukenik. They are now in the Shrine of the Book, which was established specifically to house them. By the end of 1954, there were 2 entirely separate bodies of scroll material and 2 entirely separate cadres of experts working with them. In West Jerusalem, there were the Israelis addressing themselves to the scrolls acquired by Sukenik and Yadin. In East Jerusalem, at the Rockefeller, there was a team of international scholars operating under the direction of DeVoe. Neither group communicated with the other. Neither had any contact with the other. Neither knew what the other possessed or what the other was doing, except for what leaked out in scholarly journals. In several instances, Specific texts were fragmented, some pieces being in Israeli hands, some at the Rockefeller, which made it, of course, that much more difficult to obtain any sense of the whole. So ridiculous was the situation that certain individuals were tempted to do something about it. Former Major General Ariel Sharon reported that in the late 1950s, he and Moshe Dayan devised a plan for an underground raid on the Rockefeller to be conducted through Jerusalem's sewer system. The plan, needless to say, was never implemented. Now, however, in 1967, hearing of the capture of the Rockefeller, Yadin immediately dispatched 3 colleagues from Hebrew University to ensure that the scrolls were safe. He recognized the implications of what had happened because the Rockefeller Museum was no longer an international institution, but a Jordanian one. It would pass into Israeli hands as a spoil of war. Okay, I think we're going to stop right there, and that's the end of the chapter, chapter 1. Chapter 2 is called The International Team, and this is kind of moving a little bit slow right now, a lot of details, but it'll heat up here. So come back tomorrow when we resume. Thanks for tuning in today, and have a great day.